Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, Africa Futures is a green one. The World Bank and the African Union pledge billions to help the continent invest in renewable and clean energy. Encouragement to grow green that comes as the One Planet Summit wraps up in Nairobi. Also, rescue operations come to an end in Lagos a day after a school collapses in the Nigerian city. Authorities have not yet given a final death toll, but at least 8 are reported to have been victim to the collapse. And I come to work to certify dead bodies. That's not why I'm here. Zimbabwean doctors protest emotionally about the deadly conditions of the country's public hospitals. But first, Africa has a chance to put in place a new economic model rooted in clean energy and avoid the mistakes made in the past by industrialized nations whose fortune relied on dirty energy. That's one of the messages from leaders in Nairobi for the One Planet Summit as it wrapped up on Thursday. Now, the climate meeting was held in Africa for the first time and hosted by French President Emmanuel Macron. He praised much of the advances made on the continent in employing and developing renewables. The World Bank and the African Development Bank has pledged about $47 billion by 2025 to help Africa stay on this track. Julia Steers tells us more.
International organizations and companies from France's private sector were on hand at the One Planet Summit to engage with politicians about one of the key issues on the agenda, renewable energy. President Macron congratulated President Kenyatta of Kenya for making great strides to that end. Kenya gets up to 75% of its energy from renewable sources like geothermal and hydropower. He encouraged other African countries to follow suit instead of following in the footsteps of Europe in terms of developing a reliance on so-called dirty energy sources. He also committed 1.5 billion euros to the fight against climate change.
Climate change continues to be a major threat to sustainable development worldwide. Its impact places disproportionately a heavy burden on the poor and vulnerable. We must therefore integrate climate action and sustainable development in our collective efforts to achieve the objectives under the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development.
The second key takeaway from the summit was a focus on biodiversity and combating deforestation. Kenya's President Kenyatta said that he would make up to 10% of Kenya forests by the year 2022. And Macron committed 10 million euros to help African countries develop programs that combat deforestation and preserve livelihoods.
In Nigeria, rescue operations came to a halt on Thursday, a day after a school collapsed in Lagos. Authorities have not yet given a final death toll, although at least 8 victims are believed to have died in the accident. Residents are angry as buildings regularly collapse across the country. Nicholas Chemin tells us more.
The search for survivors has ended in Lagos. Several people are feared dead after this school building collapsed on Wednesday. Emergency services worked throughout the night and into Thursday morning.
We continue our work overnight, and at about 3 a.m. we recovered the body, an adult male, at about 3 a.m. And up till now, we haven't recovered anybody.
The tragedy took place on Lagos Island. Witnesses said the school had around 100 pupils. The city's governor said the school had been set up illegally and that buildings in the area had been undergoing structural testing before the accident. But local residents are furious.
They rescued a woman. The woman was living in the house. One woman was dead. She was pregnant. The house just dilapidated a pregnant woman. But God said in this country, and we said we have a government. Is this a government in Nigeria?
Analysts say building collapses are frequent in Nigeria because regulations are poorly enforced and construction materials are often substandard. In 2014, 116 people died when a 6-story guest house collapsed at the Lagos church complex of celebrity televangelist TB Joshua.
Well, Zimbabwean doctors have spoken emotionally to the health minister about the deadly conditions of the country's public hospitals.
Meanwhile, these babies are dying. We've ordered, we've asked for these things. I'm told they're being tendered. The tender process is costing lives. They're just dying. There is no urgency, there's no priority, and nobody is listening to us.
Well, this staff picketed outside of Pariwen-Yatwa Hospital, saying that patients are dying unnecessarily because of a lack of medicine and basic supplies brought on by the country's economic crisis. Politicians and wealthy citizens openly go abroad for their treatment, and they're asking the government to deliver on promises made to try and tackle the deepening problem. Well, Ryan Truscott tells us more. He joins us now. Ryan, tell us more about what led to that meeting and what doctors are saying about the state of medical care in Zimbabwe.
Well, these were senior consultant doctors at the Pariwen-Yatwa Hospital, and they told the health minister that it's now impossible for them to do their jobs. One doctor said he was on duty last weekend and he didn't even have syringes to administer painkillers or antibiotics for 3 days. Another doctor, the head of pediatrics, Asa Mashumba, who you heard from there earlier, shed tears as she told the minister that conditions were so terrible that despite doing her very best, her output, that's what she called it, is stillbirths and disabled babies. And the head of the burns unit said that doctors don't even have bandages or antiseptic to clean wounds. And whatever bandages they do have are washed and reused. So patients are getting infections and are dying from infections.
So all of this that's being described, is it the result of something that's suddenly become worse, or is this a sharp end of a problem that's been around for a while?
Well, Zimbabwe's public health system has been in crisis for many years, and doctors went on strike for 40 days between December and January over these poor working conditions. Now what the doctors are saying is that despite the things the government promised back then, conditions haven't improved. What's different this time is that ordinary people have been given rare access to these harrowing testimonies from the doctors, that the whole meeting with the health minister was filmed and it was shared on social media. And these senior doctors don't appear to be militating for more pay for themselves. They're simply pressing for a functional hospital and for support from the government to do their jobs and to save people's lives. The head of the pediatrics unit who shed tears has become a very visible face of the anguish that the doctors are facing, and that's touched the hearts of and sparked the anger of Zimbabweans. Ordinary citizens are now rallying members of the public to try and raise money and donate towards the running costs of hospitals. So ordinary members of the public have stepped in to try and respond to the doctors' concerns, but what has the government response been? Well, state media was reporting this morning on a claim that the government has secured $1 million to pay for drugs and equipment. So there does seem to be an acknowledgement that something must be done. But everyone knows that the Zimbabwe government really doesn't have hardly any foreign currency. And some Zimbabweans have been quick to point out that the First Lady, Auxilia Mnangagwa, was on a 2-week-long visit to New York to attend a UN conference on gender, along with several other government officials, even though back home hospitals don't have basic drugs. So I think that this video of the doctor crying because of the babies she can't save has really touched a nerve among Zimbabweans, and that sadness and that anger aren't going to go away. Thanks very much. Ryan Truscott there for us in Harare. Now, in his first announcement, Algeria's new prime minister has promised to create a government that will include more young people. Noureddine Bedoui himself only took office this week. He said his new cabinet would be in place by next week. The pledge is in response to weeks of protests over 82-year-old President Abdelaziz Bouteflika's intention to run in elections that had been due in April. This week, though, he agreed not to try for a 5th term, but also cancelled those polls. A new date has not yet been set. And DR Congo's new president, Felix Tshisekedi, pardoned about 700 prisoners jailed under his predecessor, Joseph Kabila. Tshisekedi had promised the release within his first 100 days in office, and it looks like he's delivered. Many of those being let out were jailed because of their opposition to Kabila, who ran the country for 18 years until earlier this year. Now, Madagascar is struggling to contain its worst measles epidemic in decades, and all this amidst a desperate shortage of vaccines.
Nearly 1,000 people have died since October. Most of the victims have been children, and there are fears the disease will just continue to spread. Laura Berstecker has more.
In January, Dada's son began to cough. He soon developed a small rash and passed away a few days later. Within a week, 2 more children living under the same roof, Dada's niece and nephew, had also lost their lives to the measles virus.
My child was vaccinated once, but he died because we couldn't afford to get him the second injection.
Madagascar is currently facing its largest measles outbreak in decades. And if the first vaccine is free, a booster shot costs around $15, a small fortune in a country where 3/4 of the population lives with less than $2 a day. As a result, vaccination rates hover around 60%, a far cry from the 95% coverage needed to prevent the virus from spreading. Nearly 1,000 Madagascans have died from measles since October, most of them children. With the help of foreign donors, the country launched a nationwide vaccination drive at the start of the year. But humanitarian organizations warn authorities won't always be able to rely on outside help.
Neither you, me, or the international community can afford to provide 8.5 million doses every year. So there will need to be a solid system in place that can allow every Madagascan child to be vaccinated against measles at least twice a year.
As opposed to Europe and the US, where diminishing vaccination rates have been linked to growing skepticism surrounding vaccines, in Madagascar, parents usually walk for miles seeking measles shots for their children. But they often find the clinic closed, a doctor with no vaccine, or one they can't afford.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks very much for joining us, and do so again if you can. Take care.